Now, so are we going to be able to borrow and invest? The answer is yes. If you look at this slide here, India's domestic bank credit, so credit to the non-financial sector, business, small, big, medium, etc., by the Indian banks, went up rapidly in the first decade of the millennium. Bank credit really went up from 30% of GDP to 55% of GDP, and that is why we had such a bad debt problem in the second decade. And you can see that in the second decade, the bank credit to GDP just stayed flat at 55%, no growth. That is natural. So basically, one of the reasons why India had such a lackluster second decade is our companies, our businesses, and our banks neither wanted to borrow nor wanted to lend because they were still digesting all the loans made in the previous decade. So this one decade is what we call in the jargon was a decade of deleveraging, reducing your debt and bringing your balance sheets into good shape. And that is behind us. And therefore, once this pandemic-induced uncertainty is over, we will be able to once again our businesses can once again borrow and invest again. And what about the foreigners? Look at this. I have taken this chart, which is not just money coming into India. It is money coming into India minus money going out of India to outside world to invest. Indian businesses also invest overseas. The net figure is what I have taken. And as a percentage of GDP, consistently in the last 6 years, it has gone above 1.5% of GDP, whereas in the past, only 1 year we crossed 1.5% of GDP, that was in 2008-9. Whereas now, in the last 6 years, excepting for 2 years, every year we have been at more than 1.5% of GDP. And in fact, this year, the data for 2020-21 is not even complete yet. We only have 9 months of data. So foreigners are looking at relatively stable political and economic countries and are wanting to invest, and India ticks those boxes. So where is it that we are to get our act together? You look at this chart here, you can see the India's capital formation, businesses creating new assets on the ground. That has come down from 34% down to 29-30%. It has to improve. The savings rate, luckily for us, has bottomed out, the blue line, and is beginning to pick up, which is good news. You need domestic savings, and dependence on foreigners should be relatively modest. But it's important that the companies have to step up now that they have got that 1 decade of deleveraging, of repairing their balance sheet that is behind them. They need to invest. Is that happening? Well, that is what this data tells us, because in India, one of the problems is having high quality macro data. I mean, one of the basic things we need to know is, are businesses investing? And unfortunately, we have to rely on every quarter the numbers come out from the National Statistics Office, which comes with a lag of 2 to 3 months. So there is no timely real-time data available for us. And luckily, there is this projectsurvey.org, a new private sector initiative that's come up to capture this data. And you can see here, and I have given you the URL from the website, basically compared to Q3 to Q4, if you simply take the numbers, 2.95 lakh crores, now it is 3.9 lakh crores. From 3 lakh crores to 4 lakh crores, investment is picking up. That is 33% growth between one quarter to the other. You can do it from the point of view of sectors. You can view from the point of view of source or which states are benefiting. It is good to see states like Orissa, Andhra, Uttar Pradesh are in the top of the list rather than the southern states and the western states. So investment spending is indeed beginning to rise. And if you look at the infrastructure, always the freight carried by railways is much less expensive than the freight carried by road, which is also hydrocarbon incentive, petrol and diesel and pollution, etc. So the freight carried by the Indian railways has risen by almost 50% in the last 10 years. And that's a good news for us because that is more efficient and faster and less costly as well. And if you look at this, you can see here, the infrastructure plans on the railway freight corridors that are currently under construction. You have the east-west, you have the western dedicated, eastern dedicated freight corridor. So you have quite a lot of sub-corridors that are currently under construction, and the deadlines are not too far away. Once they become operational, they will be able to travel at faster speeds. They won't also congest the passenger railway lines, and their carrying capacity is much higher. Some of them can carry double-decker. So you can see here the compared to the current network and the ability of the dedicated freight corridors to do better. So I think the point here is that how is it that the 8% potential GDP growth is going to be achieved? How is it that we are going to catch up to China's GDP? I'm just sharing with you that the building blocks are coming into place. And more than that, if you look at the infrastructure, we are still way behind. All these things are small drops in the ocean. We are way behind compared to other countries in terms of the performance index. India is 44, China is 26, and the US is 14 in terms of logistics performance. And if you look at the turnaround time in Indian ports, it's 12 times slower than it is in Hong Kong and Singapore, 84 hours compared to just 7 hours in those countries. So we have a long way to go, which means it's a good thing. It's a low-hanging fruit. We can only get better instead of getting worse. And also in terms of our licensing, inspection, and compliance regime, I call it the LIC Raj. In fact, when we talk of divesting from LIC, we all think Indian government should reduce its shareholding in the Life Insurance Corporation of India. That's not I'm interested in. LIC means Licensing, Inspection, Compliance Raj. And the Indian government should divest from LIC, not the other LIC, but this LIC. And that is what I'm highlighting here. If you look at the restrictions placed on private port operators, we have to divest. We have to see if we can simplify our rules and regulations. And the team leads of Manish Sabarbal's outfit, they produced this wonderful graphic last year showing how many states and what are all the various compliance rules and regulations. So you have 69,233 compliances, 6,600 filings, and 1,536 laws or act, both center and the state, that our compliance has to. So a lot of small businesses cannot handle this. They need dedicated people to be able to. They don't even understand the language in English when these things are promulgated, and they don't have the ability to even pay for specialists to be able to help them navigate this. So they're often found to be non-compliant, and that becomes a good excuse to harass them, to shut them down, or to seek bribes from them such that their cost of operation becomes unviable. So India's compliance, LIC Raj, being dismantled is an important prerequisite for India to become a very prosperous economy, not for big businesses, but for small, micro, and medium businesses. And the good news for us is that the developed world is printing so much of money that much of it is going to find its way into countries like ours. So if we get our act together in terms of keeping our rules predictable, transparent, reasonable, and simple, more money will seek us out, and we do need that money in terms of infrastructure growth and investment growth as well. So, and this slide is more for international perspective. Some people might say, wait a second, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, foreigners can stop printing money, what happens then? Will the money come to India? This slide simply tells you, Professor Charles Goodhart of London School of Economics says, those countries have so much of debt that they want to bring it down by creating inflation. So as they say in economics, inflate your debt away is a very technical way of defaulting on your debt. And that is the mission in which developed countries are embarked on. And therefore, we will be the beneficial recipients of the money looking for solid investment opportunities. And the evidence is there. Last year, 2021, the equity market in India took $37 billion from foreigners, the highest in 30 years. You can see that. And also compared to other countries like Mexico and Brazil, our rules are becoming more predictable, more transparent, and the government is kind of simplifying them rather than making them more complicated. So in that sense, India is moving in the right direction rather than in the direction when other emerging markets are moving. So if you compare where we were in the first decade of the new millennium, at that time, India was competing with Brazil, Russia, South Africa, China. BRICS were the nomenclature. So there were many emerging market economies that were considered promising, and India was one of them. But now, fast forward 2 decades later, you look at the socio-political economic configuration in places like Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Mexico, Hungary. India is a oasis of political and economic stability and policy framework as well. I'm not exaggerating here. As I told you at the very beginning, I am prone to actually looking at the negative side of things, but compared to other countries, India is a relatively much more attractive investment destination, both for Indian investors, I mean the corporate investors, as well as foreign direct investment as well. So it is going to be a decade of, first decade was convergence, second decade was some sort of a disappointment. I wouldn't say divergence, it is a stall of convergence. The third decade, the convergence resumes this decade, and that is what we are going to witness, and what we should do to cement the sweet spot that we are in my opinion, notwithstanding the second wave. That's why I wanted to put the second wave in perspective. India should not hesitate to chart out its economic development path by itself. There is no need to stick to conventional wisdom, but conventional wisdom has been proven wrong in the Western world, where they have accumulated only a lot of debt to show for it. So in that sense, India should not be afraid of staring down the Western economic doctrines and do what is right by India. Second, India made a mistake in that sense. That is why the second bullet point substantiates the first. India liberalized trade and finance before it liberalized the real economy. It is correcting that mistake now, and therefore financial liberalization can wait. We need real economy liberalization. We can forget about the third bullet point. That is a bit technical. We will park it somewhere later. The fourth one is I've been emphasizing, divest from the LIC Raj. And the mindset of the bureaucracy must be one of letting go. And we all know in statistics, you can never control both type 1 and type 2 errors. We have to choose between the two. So whether you want an extremely moralistic compliant society, or you want a society that is able to grow, where you allow economic activity to flourish and manage by exception. And that is the choice I mean by saying letting go and regulation by exceptions. I'm not trying to preach a philosophy here, but more of an economic policy framework. And public sector banking, yes, the government is already stepping up a lot of reforms, but they need more autonomy as well. Data quality, as I told you, we don't produce employment data, we don't produce investment data. These are all the building blocks of macroeconomic policy making. So we cannot make decisions in a fact-free world, and that needs to change as well. And again, the last bullet point is more minutiae, so I will again ignore that for the time being. It's more for economic policy makers. But by and large, the message for you is that India is on the right track. The glass is more than half full. Second wave will be transient. There is a lot of work to do, but it also means that they are low-hanging fruits. And as long as we have a good framework and proceed on that basis, I think India will be able to look back in 2030 and say, we grew stronger because of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anant. That was a very informative, as well as I should say a very breezy lecture, because you went very fast through lots of data, lots of statistics, and I think we benefited enormously. Though I hope, I mean, I wish we had gone a bit slower, because I think non-economics people find it a bit difficult to digest all of this. Now, I'm sure there'll be questions. I invite those who are listening in to send their questions through chat in case they're listening on Facebook Live, because of our outage, as I mentioned in the beginning. Our router got burnt yesterday. There was some kind of power failure at 8:30, and they're still trying to get it up. But you know, I wanted to ask the first question, if I may. You know, just yesterday, Ananta, we had a talk on really on multidimensional poverty, and the different indices to measure that. And again, there was a lot of statistics and also the different ways in which poverty is being measured, what the earlier indices were, what the earlier parameters were, and what the new ones are. And the idea was that the number of people who are under the poverty line, though of course this is not merely an income line anymore, because the MDG index, which the Oxford people developed and then UN adopted, I think in 2015 or so, they have multiple parameters, which I also looked at yesterday. But the statistics really, I mean, at least what we heard yesterday, are rather alarming. For 2016, the number of multidimensionally poor stood at 364 million people in India. That's the population of the US, practically.
Yeah, so that's almost about 25%, so to speak. Yeah, 25%.
You also mentioned, again, could I just ask everyone to mute for the time being, and then when we can, when Ananta speaks, we'll mute ours and he'll speak. So please mute your mics because there's some background noise. So, I mean, this brings us to the so-called elephant in the room, which is that, earlier I talked about the disjunct between capital markets and the real economy, so to speak.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about that. You talked about paper being printed. That's going to be my second question. But the thing that I didn't mention, though I wanted to, but I thought I'd bring it later, is the elephant in the room. Everyone says is employment. They're saying there's growth without employment in India. That people are losing jobs, the rich are getting richer. I mentioned one example to you in the corporate world, but that real incomes are shrinking. Of course, you added the silver line that the default on loans is very low. That's what the statistics are showing. Not only corporate loans, but also individual loans. Of course, the RBI had a moratorium. Now they also have some kind of relief on the interest, apparently. But I look at some of these finance channels and HDFC and all people, the biggest lenders.
Yeah.
They are saying that the people are paying their installments. That's what they're saying.
That's right.
Mutual fund data is also encouraging people are actually investing again after taking money off the shelves. You talked about savings rates also being pretty steady, in fact, increasing. So my question to you is what about employment? And I had a wonderful chat with Manish Sabharwal. You mentioned Team Lease because we met up in Mussoorie at Lavasna. And he said, Makran, there's no dearth of work in India. It's just a matter of connecting people who have the skills and the people who need them. And that's the secret to success. And finally, you mentioned, the over-regulations in the Indian economy. I know somebody who started, who had a startup and it failed, and they're not allowing him to shut it down, He has to show 3 years of not making any money. He has to show that, he's taken care of his employees for 3 years. And of course, he hasn't been able to. He has no money. Some of his employees haven't been paid. So he's not going to be able to shut down his loss-making company. And the investors have pulled out. I mean, they gave him a bunch of money, all gone. So, I mean, we are in a state where we want to encourage entrepreneurship, but the regulations are so forbidding. And we in JNU we had the startup thing, so they just were throwing 15 lakhs at anybody who had an idea. Yeah. So a lot of people, what they did is they just took their 15 lakhs and did nothing. So that's also what's happening. That whenever the government incentivizes some of these things, usually nothing comes out of it. So you said we are on the right track, but sometimes I'm afraid that the distance we have to traverse is so enormous, that I mean, things may look better from Singapore, but when you're in India, you feel that. I'll give you one more last example. There's some very good things with NGOs, with Darpan and all that, FCRA rationalization, but I'll tell you, it's a nightmare if you have an NGO to get yourself certified or to get yourself approved, to get that number. Without the number, you can't renew your FCRA or ATG. So, I mean, on the one hand, need some of these. Some are malign, I agree. Some need to be regulated. But the genuine ones get clobbered because of this tremendous overregulation. 64,000 permits and licenses and clearances. It's an insane number. So, I mean, to sum up, so I'm asking you, what about employment? Isn't that the elephant in the room?
Yeah. No, I think you had brought up a lot of issues that obviously are, to put it benignly, work in progress. So, I mean, that is why I said at the very beginning, Joan Robinson's remark that, whatever we say about India, the opposite is equally true. I mean, I could say a lot of negative things, and then you can point to the report by Neelkant Mishra of Credit Suisse of 100 unicorns. So, and then say, yeah, things are happening. So I think both constitute part of the whole. And you are right about the number of 360 million being in a multi-dimensional definition of poverty. You have close to 25%. And I can believe that because even if the official numbers below poverty line is 18 or 19 or 20%, I'm sure there is quite a bunch of them who are living marginally above the poverty line. And one single unfortunate health calamity or an unfortunate death in the family could tip the family back into below poverty line, and that is still a huge challenge. Employment, the problem is, Makaran, I think we don't have good data. I mean, as simple as that. And even the relative sizes of the so-called formal sector, the sector that is somehow coming under some sort of official scanner, and the informal sector, that is people who probably operate mostly on a cash basis or do not get measured by any official statistics. Even the proportion of these two sectors is subject to wide interpretations. It depends on who is looking at it and for what purpose, rather than having some kind of objectivity attached to these proportions. So, and only in the formal sector can you measure employment relatively more accurately. And on that basis, post-pandemic, I think the employment, if you look at the RBI brings out something called a consumer confidence survey every 2 months, 6 times a year. And it asks people, and RBI surveys people on the street from about 18 cities, not just the top cities. And they do ask them about their employment prospects, how do they see? And the latest survey that came out early in April, before the Reserve Bank of India met to decide on interest rates, it is a bit sobering. And I think you are right to say, all I can say is that I think the labor market isn't firing on all cylinders at the moment. I mean, as simple as that. So I don't have the numbers to say so. But even though, as you said, the stock market is until recently was soaring into the skies, and then you have many sectors saying we are back to the pre-pandemic sales levels, etc. Will that translate into hiring intentions? And you said, sitting in Singapore, things may look much brighter, from a distance. In fact, I would even say, even sitting in India, if you are a Zoomer class, working with the Zoom and working with your laptop and working from home, things may look pretty all right for you, and for the people in the contact services and manufacturing, tourism, construction, manufacturing, etc., are the sectors where people have to go to work and they are unsure. So all I can say is I share the concern, but we don't have the data to show that employment is picking up. And if anything, I would say the consumer confidence survey of RBI tells us that people are indeed concerned about their job prospects, because companies taking advantage of the pandemic should not be, in the name of safety, moving towards more automation and technology rather than employing labor. So that is why, if you had read my column 2 days ago, when I wrote, I said we need to brainstorm on more uh, incentives, whether it is tax or non-tax incentives, to encourage hiring rather than encouraging corporate sector to opt for technology and capital solution rather than labor solution. So I think it's an important. I can only say I share the concern and I agree that it is a very important challenge. So that is where we are with respect to the employment situation. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, it's almost a Gandhian catch-22 that corporates have so much money, but they don't need people anymore to create more
Yeah.
wealth, it would seem. I mean, look at IT. IT, for instance, all the IT stocks are soaring.
Company.
Wipro,
Correct. And
Infosys, TCS, and
Wipro.
some of these. Exactly. And some of these stocks are doing well because their programmers are working to ensure that no more programmers are required, that machines will do the programming. So the paradox is they're very busy, in fact, to ensure that machines do the jobs of people. So this is the big paradox. And there's a supplementary sort of question I had, because we always talk about China and India. You also did. And of course, China became the manufacturing hub of the world. And that's what, catapulted their GDP, their prosperity levels, and all that. Now, India, I'm not sure that the nature of manufacturing having changed so much, we can't emulate that. Even if we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat and all, it seems that the sector which is going to grow is the service sector. I mean, where are the jobs? The jobs are in, for example, in delivery, in the courier service, in, uh, you know, in supplying groceries to your home, in food. The startups which are doing well are in areas of this sort. But can we become a, can the service sector and its expansion do for us what manufacturing did for China? Because what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say is good jobs are shrinking, and the only jobs which seem to be increasing are the lower paid jobs. So, instead of employment, we are having a whole bunch of people being shunted out, forced out of the middle class, because government jobs are shrunk, corporate jobs are concentrating to the top of the pyramid, where the salaries are enormous, 500 times, 700 times that of the average, and the jobs which are expanding are in the service or unorganized sector.
Mhm.
So how can the economy as a whole do well?
No, I totally agree with you again, Makarand. I think we can't necessarily emulate China purely by betting on services sector jobs. We do need the share of manufacturing at 25%, especially relatively light manufacturing, which are employment intensive compared to high-tech manufacturing. By the way, the good news is that the IT sector is indeed hiring now, which is good. They are actually looking for people. There is a people shortage because they didn't expect the businesses to be booming. So that's a good news. And also your larger question about uh, whether companies are hiring at all, technology intensive growth, etc. I mean, that is a much larger discussion. And unfortunately, the framework or the handed down to us from the West is that capital, technology, and scale. And unfortunately, our advantages were labor. And we were a capital short country given 250 years of depletion of resources with the colonial rule. So given all of that, unfortunately, we imported an economic model which was relatively unsuited to our strength, and we are still struggling to undo the damage. So that's a much larger discussion.